Hi everyone, my name's Mitchell and welcome to week 5. Today I will discuss how diversity and redundancy can increase resilience. There is a need to educate individuals on how changes in biodiversity can influence ecosystem function, as human activities have caused direct and indirect shifts in biodiversity in various ecosystems. Diversity and redundancy are broad terms that can be used to describe how well an ecosystem can respond to different disturbances under stress. Diversity can refer to genetic, species, functional, response, or ecological diversity, while functional redundancy is generally referred to when an ecological relationship is discussed. Response diversity refers to a species' susceptibility and response to a disturbance, while functional diversity refers to the functional traits different organisms can have within an ecosystem. Functional traits define species by their ecological role and how well they interact with other species and the environment. Both response and functional diversity are crucial to maintain the functions of an ecosystem during disturbances. The loss of response or functional diversity can result in massive shifts in an ecosystem's function and resilience. However, this loss can be prevented if each functional role can be performed by multiple organisms that have different responses to human-induced or environmental change. Functional redundancy refers to how well an organism can fulfill the same ecological role as another organism. When an ecosystem has high levels of functional redundancy, one species can perform the same ecological role as another species which has declined, which maintains ecosystem function. Coastal marine ecosystems have been subjected to a wide variety of human-induced and natural impacts, which has led to an overall decline in these habitats. Coral reefs are amongst the most vulnerable marine ecosystems to the effects of climate change, as mass coral bleaching events and infectious diseases have become more prevalent as global sea surface temperatures rise. Increases in global sea surface temperatures threaten the functionality of coral reef ecosystems as they induce mass coral bleaching events and mortality. 4 mass bleaching events that coincide with high sea surface temperatures have been recorded on the Great Barrier Reef from 1997 to 2017. These bleaching events have reduced coral cover and coral biodiversity. Thermal stress also increases the severity of infectious diseases as coral reefs become more vulnerable as sea surface temperatures rise. White syndrome, an infectious disease, has only been reported in locations on the Great Barrier Reef with high coral cover after high sea surface temperatures that year. This led to an overall decline in the health of the ecosystem. Global sea level increases can lead to sedimentation events on coral reefs if they are located near land-based sources of sediment. 5 mass coral reef death events occur when sea level rises outpace coral reef growth. Parts of the reef drowned as sea levels continued to rise, which flooded more of the shelf and resulted in high sediment input. When CO2 concentrations increase in the atmosphere, pH levels in the ocean decrease, as the ocean absorbs about 1/3 of the human-induced CO2 emitted into the atmosphere each year. Commonly referred to as ocean acidification, this leads to decreases in coral growth and coral structural integrity. The abundance of coral and fish species has declined due to these anthropogenic pressures on multiple scales. An urgent challenge is to understand the functional consequences of these shifts in abundance of both coral and fish species in different biogeographical locations. The functional traits of recognized zooanthid coral species were examined to discover the relationship between species richness and the diversity and redundancy of each functional trait. In the more species-poor regions, large and ecologically important areas had significantly less functional traits, only occupied by a few highly distinctive species. These dramatic biogeographical differences in redundancy could affect reef resilience and reef function. This highlights the vulnerability of species-poor locations, which are often a low priority for targeted conservation efforts. But what if these species-poor regions contain a species with high functional redundancy? The functional importance of tabular acropora has been explored on the Great Barrier Reef. When tabular acropora were present, the recoverability of shallow exposed faux reefs were 14 times higher. This was attributed to the species' high recruitment, high growth rate, and large colony size. However, there are only 10 species of tabular acropora left on the Great Barrier Reef. Among these 10 species, only 3 species are abundant and widespread, which indicates that this low level of species diversity can result in the loss of their functional role. This extensive coral loss has led to declines in fish diversity on the Great Barrier Reef. After a disturbance, fish abundance generally decreased, which resulted in declines in coral cover. Response diversity was lower in colivorous species, but was much higher in herbivorous, omnivorous, and carnivorous species. The relatively high response diversity in herbivorous fish make them arguably one of the most important species for the resilience and recovery of the Great Barrier Reef, as they can fulfill other important species' functional role in the ecosystem. The decline of coral reefs worldwide calls for current management strategies to be reassessed. To confront such a large-scale crisis would require an improved knowledge basis of the current ecological processes that affect reef resilience. These studies highlight that if redundancy is to enhance the resilience of an ecosystem, redundant species will need to have a higher response diversity. Response diversity should be a major priority when the future of an ecosystem is taken into consideration, as this could increase the resilience of an ecosystem against future disturbance, mismanagement, and degradation. Now, let's talk about this week's questions. Number 1. Using an example, when has high or low functional redundancy influenced an ecosystem's resilience? Number 2. When has high diversity in an ecosystem been mistaken for high resilience? Did this lead to a negative impact on the ecosystem? Thank you for listening.